The very last thing we need to do before we explain how the view solves the problems we're interested in is flesh out this notion of the practical situation a bit more. Because we've talked about it a lot, and I've mentioned that things like the stakes are important and what's salient is important, but we haven't really knuckled down and said very clearly what is involved in the practical situation. So essentially it's going to involve two things. One is this notion of salience that we've already talked about. So we've brought attention to the idea that possibilities can be salient to people, and this seems to have something to do with what they're attending to. Now remember, the view is an invariantist one, not a contextualist one. So the question of salient to who is answered differently by the invariantist than the contextualist. As an invariantist, we care about the possibilities that are salient to the person that we're talking about, not the person who's doing the talking. So if we're talking about Billy, and whether Billy knows that the bank is open, it's the possibilities that are salient to him that matter. However, salience isn't going to be the only ingredient in the view. And the reason for this is because of these concerns about salience that we've mentioned for the last 2 weeks. So we've noted that it doesn't seem like just because you're paying attention to something, you want to say it's salient. But it also looks like there are situations where maybe I'm deliberately ignoring things that should be relevant. So suppose I were to do this piece of practical reasoning. I was to say, well, I'm not going on safari this year, therefore I should sell my lottery ticket. Again, this looks like a bad piece of practical reasoning. It's no better than the reasoning that goes, my ticket is going to lose, therefore I should sell my ticket. They seem equally bad. But we can sort of imagine somebody doing the reasoning from the premise that they're not going on safari and sort of deliberately ignoring the possibility of the ticket winning. Nonetheless, just because they're ignoring it, we don't want to say that that inference is any better. It's just as bad, regardless of whether they're taking that possibility seriously. One option could be to start thinking more about salience and unpacking it in a different way. We could give a different view of salience from just saying it's attention. That's not what Hawthorne does here, though. So he recognizes maybe there's more we want to say about salience than this, but a different kind of thought is that, well, maybe all we need to do is just add something to the view in addition to salience. So what's important is not just what's salient to the person, but something else. And basically the something else he talks about is what kind of decision-making scenario the person is in. Here the thought is, well, part of the practical situation that's relevant for whether you know is just what kind of decisions are facing you. So in particular, if you're facing the decision whether to sell your lottery ticket, well, that's going to force possibilities where your lottery ticket might win to be relevant, and so force you to be in cases where you don't know it's going to lose. However, if you're in a different situation where you're facing different decisions, like whether to save to go on safari or not, or whether to just spend that money on a stereo, that's a different decision-making situation, and so it's a situation in which you might know. So in sum, on the view, there are two components to the practical situation. Salience is an important part of it. What you're paying attention is important. But this other feature of the kind of decision-making situation that you're in, this is also very important. It's the two together that are both going to help solve the lottery problem, but also connect knowledge to assertion and decision-making in the right way. The invariantist explanation of the argument that we started with is very similar to the contextualist one. Remember, we have the premise that I know I'm not going on safari. We seem to be able to argue from this to the conclusion that I know my ticket isn't going to win the lottery. And we think you can't know things like that, or at least ordinarily can't. So what's going on in this argument? Well, remember, Hawthorne thinks you want to maintain closure. The right response is not to say that closure is failing here. Instead, what he thinks is that this is an argument that tends to destroy your knowledge. So you start off, when you start the argument, you start off knowing the premise. You start off knowing that you're not going to go on safari. But once you start performing the argument, once you start going through the steps, you thereby bring to salience possibilities where your ticket wins, and this thereby undermines your knowledge. So although you start in a context where the premise is true, by the time you get to the conclusion, you're now in a situation where the premise is false, and the conclusion is false as well. One thing to emphasize is that the explanation here is a little bit different from the contextualist one, even though salience is the main player. Because on the contextualist explanation, What's happening is you're moving from one context to another. You start off in a context where you're talking about knowledge by low standards, and you end up in a context where you're talking about knowledge by high standards. But there's a sense in which no knowledge is ever destroyed. If it was true of you in the beginning that you knew according to low standards, then you still know according to low standards by the end. It's just you're not talking about that anymore. You're now talking about knowledge by high standards, and you never knew by high standards either proposition. You never knew either the ordinary proposition or the lottery proposition by high standards. This is quite different to the invariantist explanation, because unlike the contextualist, the invariantist really does think that your knowledge is destroyed in these kinds of situations. It really is true that once you start doing this argument, there's something that was true of you before, namely that you knew you weren't going on safari, which is no longer true of you by the end of the argument. You no longer know whether you're going on safari. So unlike in contextualism, on the invariantist view, facts about your knowledge change across the course of the argument. The contextualist said that the facts that differ are just what kind of knowledge relation you're talking about. Nothing about the knowledge relations themselves changes, but in the invariantist view, the knowledge relation does change. You start by having it, you end by not having it. Now, the lottery argument wasn't the only thing we wanted to explain. We also wanted any solution to this puzzle to explain the connection between assertion and knowledge and the connection between reasoning and knowledge. Why did we think there was a connection between assertion and knowledge in the first place? Well, it comes from the observation that it just seems to be bad to assert things like, your ticket lost. It seems to be weird to say things like that. What is the invariantist explanation of this? Well, the explanation seems to be that when you assert things like my ticket lost, you're going to raise to salience the possibility that in fact your ticket won. But once you do that, you're of course no longer going to know, it's not going to be possible for you to know that your ticket lost on the invariantist view. You're going to be asserting something that you don't know. So asserting lottery propositions is going to destroy your knowledge of them, and it's always going to force you to be saying something that you don't know. And this seems like a nice explanation of what's going on, of why we can't assert such things. We can't assert that our ticket lost because that will tend to destroy our knowledge that it lost. This seems to maintain there's an important connection between our inability to assert lottery propositions and our lack of knowledge of them. What about the connection between practical reasoning and knowledge? Well, there again, it starts from an observation about something that we can't do. So we notice that we can't reason in ways like this. We can't say, my ticket is going to lose, so if I sell it for 5 cents, that's a guaranteed 5 cents for me, so I should sell the ticket. Why is it bad to reason like this according to the invariantist? Well, it's because of your practical situation. Because now, once you start reasoning like this, you're in a context where you're trying to make a decision about whether to sell your ticket or not. You're not in a context like where you're trying to make a decision about whether to save money for going on safari. And when you're in a situation like this, where the decision you face is to sell your ticket or not, the invariantist says that's the kind of thing that is going to undermine your knowledge. Or put differently, when you're in a situation where your decision is whether to sell your ticket or not, you're going to require a lot of evidence about your ticket in order to count as knowing that your ticket is going to lose. And in particular, you're going to require more than just statistical evidence or chanciness evidence. So just knowing the odds of the lottery are not going to be sufficient to know that your ticket is going to lose if you're in a situation where the decision facing you is whether to sell your ticket or not. So again, we get an explanation of why it tends to be bad to reason in this way, and one that explains it in terms of knowledge. And the explanation is that reasoning in this way tends to put you in practical situations which destroy your knowledge of the lottery proposition. Notice this extends to the other subtly different case we talked about earlier as well. So we said, what about instead trying to argue, I'm not going to go on safari, and at the back of your mind you know closure is valid, and so concluding from that you should sell your lottery ticket. Again, you're in a situation where the practical decision you face is whether to sell the ticket or not. And when that's the decision you face, you require a lot of evidence, not just to know the lottery proposition, but also to know the ordinary proposition, because remember, they're connected via closure. So the fact that practical situations can destroy your knowledge is not going to just affect lottery propositions, it also has to affect ordinary propositions, because remember, the two are connected via closure. The final thing to do is to reflect on how this is different from contextualism. Because remember, one of the challenges for contextualism was supposed to be whether it can really explain what's going on here to our satisfaction. And the problem we saw was that there's this kind of disconnect between the way we evaluate some of these assertions and their reasoning from the way that knowledge works according to the contextualist. We said that when we're evaluating people, we look at the standards that are governing them, and that's how we judge whether they're asserting or reasoning properly. However, on the contextualist view, when you're making knowledge claims, what proposition you assert, whether you're talking about high standards or low standards, depends on the person who's doing the talking. So if I'm in a high standard context talking about somebody in a low standard situation, and I make a knowledge claim, I'm talking about whether they know according to high standards, because it's me that's doing the talking. So I'm talking about whether they know according to high standards, even though those are very different from the standards that are governing them themselves. So this led to this disconnect between the theory of knows and the theory of evaluation, of assertion and practical reasoning. But this feature does not come up in invariantism. The whole point of invariantism was to say that the situation that's relevant to a knowledge claim, the practical situation that's relevant to a knowledge claim, is the very same as the person who you're talking about. So if I'm asking whether Billy knows the bank is open, the truth of that is not determined by my practical situation, it's determined by the truth of his practical situation. So likewise, if Billy says, I know the bank is open, and I want to assess whether that assertion was proper or not, well, I ask whether he knows, and on the invariantist theory, whether he knows is determined by his standards. So now, whether he's asserting properly and whether he knows line up properly. We assert whether he asserts properly by looking at his standards. We also assess whether he knows by looking at his standards. So the two come together again. And of course, the same thing happens with reasoning. If Alice is reasoning to the conclusion that she should buy a stereo rather than continue to try to save money to go on safari, on the invariantist view, her reasoning is good just in case she knows the claims, because whether she knows the claims that are involved is dependent on the situation that she is in. So if she's in a low-stakes context, if she's in a context where the practical decision she's facing is not whether she should sell her ticket, but rather what she should spend her savings on, that's a situation which she can take for granted that she's not going on safari, because she knows that she's going on safari in that situation. In particular, she's not in a situation where the decision is whether to sell the ticket, because that's the kind of thing that would destroy her knowledge. So in sum, we've put back together on the invariantist view the two things that were supposed to come apart in a problematic way for the contextualist. For the contextualist, the way we evaluate people's assertions and their reasoning was very different from how we evaluate whether they're truly said to know something or not. These things come together again on the invariantist view. Whether somebody can be truly said to be asserting properly and reasoning properly goes by their standards, but so too does what they know. What they know goes by their standards.